Hey World Civ students, this is Ms. Hall here, and today we're going to be talking about some of the struggles and challenges that Africa has had to face since those independence movements that we talked about in the last video. So the first thing that we need to get straight is that Africa is not a country, it's a continent. Okay, there are lots of different countries that make up Africa, and each of those countries has different things going on, different struggles, different challenges, different issues. A lot of the things that we'll talk about in the video today are things that are predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, which is sort of the southern part around the Sahara Desert. Northern Africa is really very different because it's located on the Mediterranean and has a lot of contact with Europe and the Muslim world. It's very different than the rest of Africa. So when we talk about problems in 21st century Africa, for the most part, these are problems that exist predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are things like poverty, famine, disease, poor education, and ethnic conflict. And these are things that when people think about Africa, these are sort of the first things that come to mind. Now, throughout this video, we are going to focus on these, but I want you to keep in mind that there are some wonderful things in Africa as well. There are, obviously people with strong spirits and people that are working hard to make their countries better. So I don't want you to think that everything is just sort of down in the dumps, but we are going to sort of focus on those problems in today's video. So the first challenge facing Africa that we're going to talk about today is poverty. And poverty is a pretty significant issue because it's related to all the rest of the issues that we're going to talk about today. In terms of the per capita income in Africa, Africa is the only continent in the world where for the last 2 decades, the income per capita, meaning how much money each household brings in, has actually been on the decline. And the 10 poorest countries in the entire world are located within sub-Saharan Africa. What that means is that nearly half of the people in Africa live on less than $1 a day. And really and truly that means access to resources like electricity are reduced. Less than 1 person out of every 5 has electricity. And a lot of things that we take for granted. If you think about 1,000 people in Africa, only 15 of them have telephone lines, and only 7 of them have access to internet. And the reality is a lot of those are located in northern Africa, not in that sub-Saharan part. Now, part of what has led to that poverty is actually an environmental concern. Because of global warming, there has been a lot of drought in Africa. And what drought means for people who are farmers is famine. Since large portions of Africa are under this drought conditions, if you look at the bottom picture here, you can see how dry this soil is. It's obviously not going to grow food. And the people that live in those regions rely on those crops. And so when they have significant drought, there's significant starvation, people that are actually dying because they don't have food to eat. Part of this problem is this environmental drought, but part of it is also population growth. A lot of these African nations have had a really rapid population growth, which on one hand is good, but the downside of that is that their infrastructure can't handle that. They can't industrialize. They can't produce enough food to feed that population. They don't have systems in place for transporting food. You know, here, if we grow something in the Midwest, we put it on a truck or a plane or a train and we ship it to places where there's not certain crops. But in Africa, that infrastructure, that transportation of food is not in place. And so if you're not growing it where you live, if where you live is under drought conditions, then you don't have food. And so that's part of what's made it difficult for them to feed the population that's pretty rapidly expanding. The region that is facing the most of this is what we call the Horn of Africa, which is Ethiopia and Sudan. That's definitely where the drought has hit the hardest. And if you look at the map here, you can see the areas that are under crisis. Another significant issue facing Africa today that's sort of a result of famine and poverty is disease. Now, the 2 biggest causes of death in Africa are AIDS, which is the disease caused by the HIV virus, and malaria, which you guys already know a little bit about from our Malaria Flex Day. And as you hopefully learned, the rate of infection of these diseases is a lot due to the poverty and the lack of education. People don't understand how these diseases spread, how they're caused, how to protect against them. Another big factor is access to medical care. Less than 50% of the population of that sub-Saharan region of Africa has access to hospitals or doctors. They do have local clinics, but sometimes they're a full day's walk, and a lot of times they don't have enough of the needed medicines to treat, prevent these diseases from spreading. Because of these diseases, and to some degree because of famine, the average life expectancy in Africa is only 41 years old. That means that the length of time that a person is expected to live is 41 years. And the child mortality rate is actually also very high. 1 in 6 children die before the age of 5, and that's compared to 1 in 200 children in the United States. So it's a much, much higher rate due to the disease and the famine and the other things like that. Of course, that's a significant problem that the people of Africa want to work on. Another significant problem, and one that actually exacerbates or makes worse all these other problems, is the lack of education or the poor quality of education that is available in Africa. The literacy rate, meaning the percentage of people who can read in Africa, is currently right around 50%. Now, that is heavier in northern Africa, and that's definitely heavier amongst men than women. There are a lot of students, a lot of children who do not go to school at all, and there are very few in those sub-Saharan countries that continue to the final grade. They also have really large class sizes. The average is 40 students per teacher, but it's not uncommon to find schools with 60 students per teacher. And in terms of higher education and college and university education, it's pretty rare. In sub-Saharan Africa, only about 2% of women and 5% of men that are in that 18 to 23 age group are enrolled in any kind of higher education. There's also a lot of attrition, meaning a lot of people who do pursue higher education actually leave Africa. So they're traveling to other countries to work. And so that knowledge that they gain is not staying and benefiting their country. So of course there are movements to improve this. There are lots of educational organizations internationally that are coming in and trying to help with education in Africa. There are also a lot of movements from within Africa to try to strengthen education. But again, this is a challenge because of poverty, because of disease. It's very hard to think about and worry about going to school when you're worried about growing enough food to feed your family. All right, the last significant problem that we're going to talk about today actually grows out of these other problems that we've talked about, and that's conflict and civil war. A lot of people are fleeing Africa and specific parts of Africa because of conflicts and civil wars. There have been over 9 million refugees. Now, refugees are people that flee their country, or internally displaced people, people that leave their homes but stay within the country because of these conflicts. And really and truly hundreds and thousands have died. Now, a lot of times this conflict comes as the result of government changes, people that want democracy fighting against those that want to stick with older governments, conflict over lands, over territories, over resources. There's a lot of ethnic groups in Africa that are very different and diverse, and we talked about this way back when we talked about the partition of Africa and how the European power sort of just drew random lines and divided Africa up and didn't pay attention to which ethnic groups were located within those regions, and that's led to a lot of conflict. Particularly in Rwanda, some of you may be familiar with that. Now, this conflict and civil war also plays into the poor education. A lot of times when your country is under war and you're being fired on or living in hiding, it's not possible to pursue your education. And a lot of children actually get drawn into the conflict, and there's a major effort right now to end the use of children as soldiers in Africa because there are a lot of very young children, like the ones you see here, serving in the military forces in some of these regions that are facing pretty significant conflicts or civil wars. I'm not going to go into detail with all the different conflicts and civil wars because there are so many of them, but know that there are parts of Africa still where there is significant conflict going on, and where the main thing that people are facing in the day-to-day is how to survive and how to get the resources that they need. All right, so that is a very, very short overview of some of the major conflicts that are facing Africa today. Poverty, famine, disease, a lack of education, and then conflicts and civil wars. Now, I said it at the beginning of the video, but I feel the need to say it again at the end of the video. We, as Americans and a lot of Europeans, see Africa as a place that is really struggling and that we want to go in and help and we want to support and we want to take care of, but we have to be really careful because sometimes that comes across and is sort of self-serving and patronizing. In what we really need to see happen and what we really need to help happen is for those strong leaders and those people that are within Africa that are passionate about changing their nations to help empower them to make the change that they want to see happen in their countries. So I want us to be really careful about seeing Africa as this place where everybody is starving and everybody is uneducated, because that's not true. The truth is there are a lot of strong African leaders that want to see improvement for their own countries. And so we need to be wary of sort of this savior mentality that we can come in and we can fix Africa. And we need to instead be supportive of the people from within the country that want to fix their countries. All right, that brings us to the end of this video. As always, ask your teacher if you have any questions and be ready for a quiz tomorrow.